right, welcome back everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell. This is episode 51, and today I am joined by Dr. Sunila Kale and Dr. Christian Novetzke, both of whom are professors at my alma mater, the University of Washington, where they teach in the Jackson School of International Studies. Christian and Sunila, warm welcome to Yogic Studies. It is such a pleasure to have you here. How are we doing today?
Good, Seth. It's good to see you've done well after your education here at the University of Washington. We're very proud of you and really proud of all that you've accomplished with yogic studies. It's extraordinary.
And thanks so much for inviting us to be a part of your community. You really built something remarkable.
Yes. Thanks so much. It's kind of a full circle moment for me to have you both here, just to get to reconnect. We had you on at the conference that we did back in the fall, the Yoga Vidya conference, and getting to reconnect with your work and your scholarship, and now to get to host you here on the platform. For me, it's very personally meaningful. I owe a debt of gratitude to you both. On a personal note, Christian was my MA advisor at the University of Washington. And I often say I feel like you sort of initiated me into grad school and the world of South Asian studies. So mostly fond, some painful memories of being an early grad student in Seattle, but wonderful memories of even having dinners at your lovely home and chai events. And I think I can even remember a conversation we once had at your home about the Bhagavadgītā and yoga and politics and maybe early seeds of this book and project. So yeah, for so many reasons, it's just so great to have you both here. And congratulations to both of you on this incredible book, which is obviously a long time coming, because the seeds of which I think were born back when I was a grad student at UW. And so I know you've worked for a long time and you've worked very hard on this book, and it's fantastic. So congratulations on finishing it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Very kind of you to say. It really did take a long time.
Grad school takes a long time too. Every good thing takes a long time.
So tell me a little bit about the origins of the book. Sunila, maybe you can start. Just how did you guys get started working on this book, The Yoga of Power? I'll read the full title. The Yoga of Power, Yoga as Political Thought and Practice in India, published by Columbia University Press. Where did this book begin?
Well, we very in loose terms, we kind of sketched the origins of it in the preface of the book, where we kind of say that around 2014 and 15, there were a few things in the air that were bringing yoga and politics together in interesting ways. There were court cases in California around whether yoga instruction in public schools contravenes the separation of church and state. There were a set of resurgent debates about cultural appropriation, which have not really left us since then. And then, Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party were elected in 2014 in India's parliamentary elections. And his first big public global speech in the UN General Assembly late that year, that was an address in which he called for an International Day of Yoga. And so since 2015, the world has marked that day every June. So we thought it was really interesting that yoga kept colliding in the worlds of legal politics and cultural politics and international affairs. And as we thought initially, we would try to say something to make meaning of these interconnections. In reading this rich body of literature in yoga studies, which is really multidisciplinary and such a rich, vibrant body of work, we kind of noticed that there was a kind of concerted or a settled idea that yoga means either philosophy or psychophysical practice. And we were really curious about what it might mean to think about yoga itself as an expression or a theory of politics and power. So we moved from thinking about yoga and politics, right, to thinking about yoga itself as a kind of politics. And our book is like an attempt to understand it for ourselves and then to convey that to our readers.
Mm-hmm. And you have a background as a political scientist, is that right? Can you tell us maybe a little bit about your background and training and how that informs your work on this book and your approach to yoga?
Yeah, it's an interesting collaboration. As a political scientist and a historian of religion, we kind of thought that was a natural. It was natural for us to work on this project together. I think it transformed in ways that we could really not have anticipated in the course of the last decade. It also was something that we really couldn't have done separately. I certainly speak for myself. Like it is not a domain that I would have entered without, a collaboration with someone who does study religion professionally. My work as a political scientist is really to think about development and political economy. That's what all of my previous work has been. So this is very much a departure for me. And I think that the same is true for Christian. This is a departure for him. So it really is the result of a collaboration that has changed how we both approach our work.
Yeah, and Sunila mentioned my background is in history of religion, studying Indian religions and studying them mostly through vernacular sources, so Marathi and Hindi and old versions of those languages. And I've also studied Sanskrit and can read it and kind of understand what's there, though I'm not a Sanskritist at all like you or many others that have been on your podcast and done yogic studies courses. But this kind of was kind of a benefit in some ways, because Sunila also is not a Sanskritist, but she is someone who works in Marathi and in Hindi. And so we kind of started with a very, for lack of a better word, kind of vernacular interest in these questions. And since neither of us has a kind of like personal yoga practice or interest in any sort of lineage that brings us into this, it meant that our questions are really very fundamental. We were just interested in what kind of constituted yoga without presupposing that constitution would be hatha yoga or a psychophysical practice or a lineage practice or sankhya or something embedded in any particular text. And so that, that the kind of collaboration between us meant that those, not only did we bring sort of different perspectives, but the kinds of things we share in our work, like the emphasis on working in vernacular languages, working in regional languages, just kind of changed the conversations that we felt that we could have that may be somewhat different than what we were reading in a lot of kind of yoga studies that sought a particular kind of yoga, a history of a particular kind of yoga, which is almost always hatha yoga, some sort of psychophysical yoga.
I think as Christian says, we bring an interest in thinking about South Asia through its diverse language traditions. We also bring an interest as scholars in grounded fieldwork. So it's something that I think marks our book. And there's I think a growing number of scholars who do use fieldwork methods in their studies of yoga, whether it's ethnography or archival work. And we bring a bit of both, mostly archival work, but we did a lot of interviews in the course of doing this book. Some of them don't appear directly as evidence in the book, but are really important as the background context that informs how we think about the subjects of the book.
Yeah, I hope we can get into that a little bit more later. But I'll just echo, there's a rich diversity of source material from the Sanskrit textual tradition to Hindi and Marathi and English language works that I think is a real strength to the book. So you open the book by saying, this is a book about yoga, but not about that yoga. So tell us, kind of in a nutshell, what is the book about? What is it not about?
Well, if you keep reading, then you'll see. But yes,
I know.
What we say right after that is, we're interested in thinking about the broad history of this word yoga and a broad history of the way it's been studied. So these are two different things. There is the way that one studies a subject, but then there's that material that's out there to be studied. And we have found that the dominant, let's say, kind of yoga that's studied in yoga studies is either psychophysical yoga, of which Hatha yoga is the number one kind of thing, or Sankhya and other philosophical kinds of approaches, including engagements with the Bhagavadgītā, but Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and so on. So those are, let's say, two spheres. We wanted to develop the idea that a third sphere might exist that is robust like these other two, that is consistent over time, but is not these other two, is not just folded within, is yet distinct. So when we say that this is a book about yoga, but not bad yoga, what we mean is it's about very much about a long tradition of yoga that is distinct from but intersecting with these other two spheres, the psychophysical on the one hand, and the philosophical on the other.
And Sunila, when you said you kind of started thinking about this topic by looking at the intersection of yoga and politics, but then you sort of shifted and to think about yoga as politics or as political thought and practice, as this kind of third sphere, right, Christian, that you're speaking about. So what does that look like in practice and in thought? What is the yoga of power?
Yeah, that's a great question and a good way of phrasing it. I think that we also had been kind of convinced by the dominant framings that yoga means either philosophy or psychophysical practice initially. And when we initially thought we were going to write about yoga and politics, we understood yoga to be this stable idea. Well, yoga means these two things. It's either philosophy or mind-body practice. So we were going to look at that in politics. But, one of the things that we point out in the book is that these key texts of Hatha Yoga, the Amrita Siddhi, one of the oldest Hatha texts that we have, the most famous, the Hatha Pradipika, they have these curious passages in the opening sections of the text, which enjoin a yogi to find a properly governed land for their practice. And we just kept kind of our minds kind of kept snagging on those portions. I kept wondering, like, why would a text on Hatha Yoga have anything to say about the socio-political world? Why should a yogi be concerned with that? Why does one need to practice yoga in a land that is properly governed, virtuous, and prosperous, and stable? Why is that important? And what does that mean if these key texts of Hatha Yoga want us to think about this? Like, is yoga itself telling us something about power and politics? That was one of the, there are lots of, usually for books, you can trace a number of different origin points, but certainly reading those Hatha texts, that was one place that sort of made us think, okay, there's something going on. And what would it look like to relax that presupposition that we know what yoga is, to relax that for ourselves and enter into textual worlds in which the word yoga appears, but doesn't mean those things, right? To sort of free our own reading and mind to allow us to think about what yoga does mean in those contexts in which it operates and doesn't mean philosophy and mind-body practice.
Yeah, we have we have in the intro, we talk about these three terms: yoga, politics, power. And what we mean by politics is really a kind of contention over power, over things that are powerful by people, right? And it's a kind of management. We talk about this work of Chantal Mouffe. It's a kind of management of agonism. And so for us, politics is that battle over power. And we think that yoga has something to say about that because at a very fundamental level, even just in terms of the etymology of the word, it has a direct relationship to power. As probably most of your listeners know, the word is cognate with the English word yoke. So it's a word that signifies a way to control something. In this case, it's a horse or it's a cow or whatever, but a yoke controls an animal, and it controls an animal so that a human can use that animal's power for itself, right? And that's what a yoke does. So we think that that very word is resonant, and we want to pursue what that means. So we define yoga as the means of controlling something powerful. So we describe this as the kind of quality of the transfer of power that takes place. That you have a subject, you have a verb, which is yoga, and you have an object, a thing that's controlled. And this is how then we kind of start to think at a very elemental level of what yoga might mean in terms of power. That it names the skillful approach, the method that one uses to harness something that is powerful, whatever that thing might be, right? And we leave that wide open, whatever that thing might be that's powerful, whatever the subject might be, or the object that it seeks to control. So that's how we kind of bring those three things, yoga, politics, and power, together, and try to, from that, build out a narrative, a history, a set of studies that really look at moments where we think that concept is applied, where we think that's what yoga means, either explicitly, which takes place in the first part of the book, we think very clearly, or implicitly, that takes place in the second part of the book.
Great. Well, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the structure of the book, and maybe just kind of paint kind of the big picture overview of what you set out to do throughout the book, and then maybe we can zoom in on some particular details or questions.
Yeah, so the book is kind of a curious structure in that it's two very distinct halves. The first half, after we lay out the sort of theoretical approach that we take and sort of motivate the concepts that we use in the book in the introduction, the rest of the book is organized in two parts. In the first part, we try to recover kind of textual genealogy for this kind of yoga as a theory of power. And in that part of the book, we look at a series of texts in which the word appears, and it appears in domains that are very, very much the world of politics. So in the Rg Veda, in the Mahābhārata, and within it the Gita, and in the Arthaśāstra. The Arthaśāstra is India's premier text, ancient India's premier text of statecraft or governance or political economy. The Arthaśāstra is often described as like akin to Machiavelli's The Prince, like a manual for governance. And we thought, with that text in particular, if we can find yoga in that text, if yoga as a concept is in a text like that, then really there's something to what, to this idea that it is a word relevant to power and politics. And indeed, it appears all over the text, but it doesn't appear in relation to philosophy or mind-body practice. The second half of the book jumps over several millennia to emerge in the modern period. And we look at how yoga comes to animate anti-colonial nationalist politics, both among sort of well-known nationalist figures like Gandhi and Tilak, and then how yoga as the form of Surya Namaskar gets taken up in the princely state of Aund. And those are the two halves of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say that the structure of the book follows, in some ways, what we learned from yoga studies. So what we learned from yoga studies is that you have this emphasis on textual genealogies. And so you have a great deal, usually Sanskritists, working on various stages and aspects of the textual history of the thing that you want to call yoga. And I think, Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton's book, Roots of Yoga, is a great example of this, because they're really providing by roots of yoga, and they're very clear about this in their introduction. They mean psychophysical yoga and Hatha yoga in particular. Mm-hmm. And they're drawing mostly from Sanskrit texts to show that the roots of these practices are textual. So from that, what we learned is we need to provide a textual set of roots, right? And so that's what we do in part one. We try to provide those roots in that way that's legible and sensible in a common pathway in yoga studies. And then the second part of the book, we kind of note this other aspect of yoga studies, which looks at yoga in the modern world. And again, Mark is someone who has worked in that field quite extensively, as we know from his outstanding and really path-breaking book. And in that context, you have people grappling with how whatever that thing is, with those traditional ancient and so-called roots, kind of emerge in the modern period. So we wanted to do that as well, right? So we saw yoga studies divided in these two ways: people who study kind of contemporary modern sort of kind of yoga, and people who do these traditional classical genealogies and are more textualists. The book is meant to represent yoga studies in that way, to speak into yoga studies. And something that we both really felt as we were writing this book is we were trying to write a book that is an open invitation. We are not like fundamentally constituted by yoga studies as scholars, so we didn't feel we were kind of in this sphere and trying to kind of carve a space for ourselves or something. We really just admired it and wanted to offer something into it that we thought wasn't really there as we had presented it. But one of the things we note throughout the book, and if you read the book, you'll see that what we rely on are all the scholars who have done work that allows us to write the book. My Sanskrit is not great. And so if it weren't for the extraordinary work of Patrick Olivelle or Stephanie Jameson, Joel Brereton, or so many others, we rely on Laurie Patton's extraordinary translation of the Gita and so on, Mark McLeish's work. If it weren't for that work, we never could have done that work. Or in the modern period, Joe Alter and Mark and so many scholars who have studied the modern period, we really rely on all of that. And theoretically, we rely on Pratima Banerjee's extraordinary work, many scholars who are thinking about political theory outside of the modern Western world. So that's why we mean it's an invitation. And that's kind of how we structured the book, to invite people into a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we don't think of either halves of the book as being exhaustive in any way, right? The text that we chose, we have reasons for having chosen them, but there are others, and we hope that if the book has any utility, others may take up some of the ideas that we suggest in their own studies of other texts that could be folded into that first half of the book, and certainly other individuals and events, that are left out of the second half of the book.
No, I think you guys have offered something incredibly useful and novel to the field of yoga studies, as you put it. And I think most listeners will probably know, that if you look at the word yoga in the Sanskrit English dictionary, you have this extremely long entry of possible meanings, from strategy, a charm, a constellation, a trick, magic, to let alone some type of concentration or contemplative, meditative, or psychophysical practice. I mean, it's one of the longest entries, I think, in the dictionary. But what do we make of that? What do we make of then all these other entries? So I think what you guys have kind of done that's kind of so wonderful is you've actually taken maybe a sphere of those entries that are in the political or the realm of power and politics, or statecraft, and then you've found, you've traced the sources of, where are those meanings of yoga coming from, and actually found a genealogy and kind of a tradition there. So tell us a little bit more. Let's kind of get into some of those early Sanskrit sources that you look at, like the Rg Veda and the Mahābhārata and Arthaśāstra. And how do you see yoga as politics? How do you see it operating there? And then you guys, what's great is you don't leave it in the past. You trace how this is then informing, modern, early modern nationalists and contemporary politics in India today. So yeah, tell us just a little bit more of what is the word yoga even doing in those texts, and how does it develop?
Well, I think I'll just start with some thoughts. So the Rig Veda is a text, maybe 1400 BC or something. That's one of these texts that's compiled over a long period of time. There's no single author, hundreds, who knows? Even if you can't even really speak of this text in relationship to those kinds of very clear idea of author and text. So it's compiled over a broad period of time, and the word yoga appears only a handful of times, and it's a huge text. But where it appears, it has consistent meanings, and the meaning is drawn from its root, meaning to yoke, where it's consistently applied to the idea of yoking a war horse to a chariot in an act of war, preparing for war. And that meaning carries through in multiple ways in that text. And it's very clear to see, and we're not the first to point that out. What we try to do is, if we start from that point of view, so if you decide you want to look at yoga, and instead of looking for psychophysical yoga, you just look at the word and you see what's there, what you see is a word that more or less means war. Right? It means preparing for war. It more or less means war. When you move into the Mahābhārata, which is now composed somewhere between, let's say, the 3rd, 5th century BCE and all the way up to the 3rd century CE, it's being formalized. But, in that, the Bhagavadgītā arises. You see the word yoga now has proliferated. It means so many things. And to give you just one example, in the Bhagavadgītā, Krishna is speaking to Arjuna, and he is called a Yogeshwar 3 times. And the first time is when he shows his cosmic form. So he's a Yogeshwar in some sort of philosophical cosmic way. He's everything. Many people have related this to a kind of Sankhyan idea, right, of a kind of cosmos expanding and contracting, and Krishna is one with that and can show that. And then the second time has to do with, as I recall, it's right at the end with Yoga Shastra. So he's a master of yogic texts, of yogic practices in that philosophical psychophysical mode. But in the
breathing techniques and techniques of concentration.
Yeah, but in the very last line of that text, the entire text, he's called a Yogeshwar one last time. And in that moment, he's called a Yogeshwar. Many scholars have argued, and we agree, because he gets Arjuna to fight the war. And remember, that's the whole point of the Bhagavad-gītā. The whole point of the conversation is to get this guy to fight this war. So he's a Yogeshwar because Krishna is a strategist and has figured out the strategy, the yoga, to get Krishna to do what he's supposed to do. Now that's just one example. We give multiple examples of how yoga means all of these things separately, together, intersecting, so that kind of old Rig Veda idea of yoga's war moves into the Mahābhārata and is expanded into multiple kind of ways and places. One of those places is also, so the Bhagavad-gītā happens obviously before the war, right? It's to get the war going. The war happens, yoga appears there very commonly, then the war occurs. After the war has ended, there's this kind of parallel section to the Bhagavad-gītā. And this is the Shanti Parvan. So this is the peace book, the book that comes after the war, the book of peace. And there you have a different prince, a brother of Arjuna, who is getting a lecture from another Yogeshwar. This guy is Bhishma, who's actually has been their opponent, but was also someone who taught them as their granduncle. And he also is now giving a lecture, and he's on this bed of arrows. And that's what's here, right? This is the bed of arrows. Yes, from the Razam Nama. Yes. A Mughal era illustrated manuscript of the Mahābhārata. And there, his lessons are about rulership, mostly. They're kind of divided into 3 sections, but mostly he's talking about rulership. And there yoga appears, and there very often what yoga means is ways to govern, strategies for governing. And then as he's closer towards dying, he also talks about yoga and moksha, meaning release, or the ultimate kind of goal of releasing your soul. And there, that kind of yoga is about spiritual practices and psychophysical practices. So even in that small text, the Bhagavad-gītā, and this large text, the Mahābhārata, you see the full expanse of this word yoga. But what we kind of argue, and other scholars have talked about, that the Mahābhārata is also working through what this word means now, because it must still mean war. This is a text on war. That's fundamentally what the Mahābhārata is, a story about a war. So if yoga appears all over in that text, it has to have a relationship to war, right? It's just a logical conclusion you can draw. And so it's that Rg Vedic idea that's getting changed and manipulated and applied to these other kinds of powerful pursuits, such as controlling your mind, controlling your breath, controlling your body, controlling, though, other people, controlling your relationship with death. All of these things start to come out. And when we get to the Arthaśāstra, there, as Sunila points out, the word yoga is all over that text, but nowhere does it mean psychophysical practice or kind of a Sankhyan philosophy. There, what it really means is any skillful means you have to control your population. Very often, that skillful means is related to some sort of military activity, either a covert, secret, spycraft kind of thing, or just mobilizing and organizing your armies. And your listeners might be interested, who are attuned to Indian languages, that yoga is described as vyayama. So yoga is described as vyayama, which in Hindi and in Marathi would mean exercise. Here, what it means is the exercise of your military might. So you're exercising your military power.
You also, this is something I actually learned from you guys at the Yoga Vidya conference when you spoke. From the Arthaśāstra, there's this particular usage of the term yoga to refer to the yoga purusha or the yoga stri, this sort of yoga spy. Tell us a little bit about that. What is a yoga spy in the Arthaśāstra? Is this something? Is it unique to the Arthaśāstra, or do you find this elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I guess my answer to that would be that this is one of those places where the fact that this is not an exhaustive book leaves like lots of space for other people to look at other niti shastras, other texts of Sanskrit and non-Sanskrit texts on governance, to see how these ideas might be reflected or contradicted or nuanced there. We have looked at this one text on governance. And in that text, as you say, the Yoga Purusha and Yoga Stri are kind of high-level military and intelligence operatives. They're, they carry out covert missions. They are sometimes assassins. The Yoga Stri in particular kind of goes behind enemy lines and uses powers of seduction to corrupt and influence the enemy. And I'll just add to what Christian said about the Arthaśāstra. The mandala is another key concept in the Arthaśāstra. And the way we sort of make sense of it for ourselves and in the book is that if the mandala, right, that set of concentric circles in which the king sits surrounded by enemies who are then surrounded by potential allies in ever expanding spheres, if the mandala describes the political field, then yoga describes the kind of tactics of moving through that sphere, right? Yoga yoga is the set of strategies that you use to harness your allies and to flip your enemies. And you use the Yoga Purusha and Yoga Stri to carry out that agenda on the playing field, on the field, which is the mandala.
Yeah,
sort of
I
James
think
Bond of classical
sure.
India. Where's the movie rights to this here?
I think that to add something to what Sunila is saying, that so the mandala means circle, right? And it plays with this idea of a king who has enemies or who has other kingdoms that are abutting his kingdom. And so the question is, what do you do with those enemies? Do you convert them? Do you conquer them? And then once you conquer or convert one, then you conquer or convert. You have to deal with who's at the periphery of now that expanded circle. So it's a very interesting idea of how an individual manages the uh, the potentiality of power around him or her for them, right? That I say this because, for again, anyone attuned to the yoga world, mandala is going to be a familiar term. Vyayama will be a familiar term. So it's interesting to know that these familiar terms in that other kind of psychophysical, philosophical world are present here in this like statecraft world. It suggests that these are interlinked worlds, that there is not really an understanding that the kind of yoga we lay out has ever really been separated from the other kinds of yoga, say the yoga described in the Roots of Yoga, or say Patanjali's yoga, Patanjalaya Yoga Shastra, which is referred to later, especially in Hatha texts, as a Raja Yoga, which is both a yoga of kings, but also a yoga of rulers, of people with power. Or even the concept of Hatha Yoga, which has embedded in it the idea of force, right? Hatha meaning force. There are ways that you can think that these are circulating concepts around yoga that don't distinguish just a narrow kind of well, it's not narrow at all, but a psychophysical pathway or a philosophical pathway.
Yeah, they're not. We suggest that the yoga that we're tracing, the yoga as it relates to power and politics, is a domain in which the word operates and has meaning. It's intelligible, but it's also very clearly intersecting with the other spheres of yoga. And one of the things that we suggest in the introduction of the book is that, one of the reasons that the concept of yoga is so interesting is that it refuses a neat separation or categorization of religion and politics, right? Or the interior and the exterior. So it sort of forces you to collapse and question binaries that seem settled.
So I think some listeners, I anticipate, might think, and I think you've already addressed this to some degree, and say, yoga doesn't have anything to do with politics. True yoga is this. Real, authentic yoga is spiritual or soteriological. It's rooted in these texts or these, set of practices. Maybe these ancient texts, the Rg Veda, Mahābhārata, Arthaśāstra, are using the term yoga, but that refers to something else. That's not talking about my yoga or the true yoga, if you will. And you bring this up, this potential critique in the book, this idea of the word yoga as a homonym, this idea that you could have two different words that look and sound the same, but they're actually referring to two totally different things, and in effect then are two different words. I seem to recall Mark Singleton suggested this in his Yoga Body when referring to the now English term yoga, referring to kind of this more modern phenomenon of postural practice, which has a very complicated history, of course, and then the more ancient Sanskrit word yoga. We might even throw in the Hindi yog now, which sometimes gets in there to try to differentiate as well. But this idea of the same sound and same letters, but that they're actually referring to two different things or have different meanings. What is your kind of sense of this idea of yoga as a homonym?
I expect that people will read the book and conclude that. What I would say is that, the elemental definition of yoga that we offer, a means of controlling something powerful, which we see very clearly in the text that we look at, is also a useful definition of yoga in all the other contexts that it operates. So even if they are distinct, there is something fundamentally related about what the word means and what it refers to in contexts that are as different from the texts of Hatha Yoga and the Arthaśāstra.
Yeah, and I think that there are multiple ways to answer this question. There's a linguistic answer. So Sanskrit is, the word Sanskrit means perfected. And it is a I don't mean this in any offensive way, but it's an artificial language. It's a language that was constructed to be almost like a computer language, clear, direct. It has it's artifice. It's a beautiful language, but the language has a kind of mathematical quality to it, so that it's been planned. It's a language that has been refined, and it is not a language you grow up speaking. It's not a language. It's not a mother tongue. And homonyms tend to appear in languages like mother tongues. They tend to appear in languages like English or in Hindi or Marathi that are actually a collection of multiple worlds that are converging, right? So in Marathi, kam means work and kam means love, right? It means sort of different things. And the kam that means work probably comes from karma, whereas the kam that means love comes from kama. So the idea that you would have homonyms in Indian languages is quite common, but it's not very common in Sanskrit. It's unusual in Sanskrit because it would be confusing to the program to have homonyms. But even if homonyms were common, what we feel we have done, and what you can very clearly see in the first part of this book, is that the textual sources we're going to would not agree with that perspective. That when the word means a constellation, it's referring to a powerful conjunction, the yoking of powerful forces, right? And so it also means that when it refers to a battle strategy, and it also means that when it refers to the techniques a person uses to control their minds. So we think that a homonym is different from a word in a set of languages in a linguistic sphere that is as old as India's, right? We think that it's different when a word comes to mean multiple things, right? Wendy Doniger has that famous statement where she says every Sanskrit word means itself and its opposite. But that doesn't mean that it's a homonym. It just means that over time and in the creativity of human thinking and human activity, the word has expanded its meanings. What we think is that when people make the homonym argument, what they're actually saying is what I think is authentic yoga, what I believe is authentic yoga, that kind of yoga isn't reflected in what I'm seeing you talk about. And there's nothing you can do to address that perspective. It's just the perspective that they have. But if we address it from a linguistic point of view or a historical point of view or textual point of view, or any point of view really of evidence, we don't think that the homonym argument can hold any weight.
Your question is also interesting because, to jump ahead to the second part of the book, this was actually a question that a lot of the nationalists who were reading the Gita and describing themselves as yogis were in. This was a sort of discursive battle, or a battle over meaning and definitions that they were very much engaged with. So, someone like Aurobindo Ghosh and Lajpat Rai, they write these short essays early in the first decade of the 20th century, in which they sort of say to their fellow Indians, don't let anyone convince you that the message of the Gita is to remove yourself from society. That the message of the Gita is for you to meditate. The message of the Gita is for you to act. Yoga means to act. Yoga requires you to act. It enjoins you to act. And each of the figures that we look at has a slightly different interpretation of how yoga can animate politics. But they are all in that general direction. So the idea that someone would disagree with our meaning with what we're proposing as the meaning of yoga, that's probably as old as yoga itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and let me add one thing to what she said, because and to go back to your point, that some people will say that yoga is actually this soteriological practice, it's philosophical, it's excised from the world of politics. One of the things we look at are court cases that occurred in the early 20th century where would-be assassins or actual assassins who are Indian nationalists fighting for Indian independence against the British would carry out bombings or assassination attempts, and they would refer to this as yoga. And when it appeared in the court cases, the argument that the British government would make is that these people were corrupted, that they used the word yoga for something that doesn't have anything to do with actual, real, proper yoga, which is spiritual quietude and acquiescence and kind of, giving up, an interest in worldly desires. So in those court cases, you can see the imposition of a whole group of sort of Orientalist, colonialist thought saying real yoga is just renouncing the world, which is why you have these nationalists saying, don't be fooled by that message. Yoga is about political action in this moment.
There's this really interesting essay, maybe it started as a speech that Tilak made in the early decades of the 20th century, where he says, India's history can be divided into two types: the age of renunciation and the age of battle. I forget exactly what terms he uses, but if you are so fortunate as to find yourself in the age of renunciation, then fine, your yoga can mean finding a hut and sitting quietly and meditating. But if you live in a moment of turmoil and upheaval, which is how he described the British period in the early 20th century, then you don't have the luxury of retreat, of renunciation. To do yoga in such moments requires action, and it requires action in the political domain. So he kind of said, yoga, the reason yoga means these two different things is because the context is different. The context in which someone is a yogi changes. And if you're a yogi in British India, you don't have the luxury of retreat, of renunciation.
And let me add just one more layer to this. So one of the people that we look at is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is a leader of India's Dalit so-called untouchables. And here he adds yet another meaning to the word yoga. He says, when you see the word yoga, don't be fooled. It's not about political liberation action. It's not about quietude. It's about returning to a form of high caste Brahminical patriarchy that will come into place if the British leave India. He wanted the British to leave India, but he was worried that pre-existing structures of caste and gender oppression would come in to replace it. So that's what he read in the word yoga, right? Which very well could be, again, another meaning of the word yoga.
He understood it to be a political concept. It just wasn't a politics of liberation for him.
But what they all share is the idea that yoga is, in all of these cases, a skillful means to control something powerful, right? For Ambedkar, it's to control society and return to a traditional way of life. For Tilak, it's to resist British rule. For others, it may be to reach moksha, samadhi, nirvana.
So one of the other great contributions I think you make to yoga studies is your work on Surya Namaskar. Actually, I think this place that you found where the psychophysical and the political really intersect. This relates to some of your field work that you were speaking about in the beginning. You guys have a chapter looking at the Raja of Und and the kind of physical, cultural context and stately context, where perhaps Surya Namaskara, or where our earliest sources for Surya Namaskara perhaps are to be found. Without giving everything away, because we want people to read the book and take the course, but tell us a little bit about what you found about Surya Namaskara and this film that you were able to find and make public.
Yeah, I mean, the Raja of Und is the super interesting figure. He was like very invested in the kind of global physical culture movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. So in his Marathi autobiography, he talks about, the various kind of fads that were traveling across Germany and North America and other parts of Europe. And he was a Raja, so he had the wherewithal, the resources to subscribe to the journals and to get the bodybuilding equipment and to practice these things. And he was really quite invested in all of it: nutrition, diet, and all of this changes. He tells us in his autobiography when he's chastised by a neighbor, the prince of a neighboring kingdom, who says, like, you have the best of all exercises at hand, the Surya Namaskar. Why are you doing all of these foreign things? So he tells us from that time on, he gives up everything. He gives up everything else and devotes himself fully to the Surya Namaskar. And it's about the time that he ascends the throne and becomes the king of this princely state. But the Surya Namaskar for him is clearly an exercise that sharpens the mind and strengthens the body, but it is fundamentally about controlling oneself. So it is a practice that is essential for self-rule, for self-governance. And it's that idea of Surya Namaskar as an element that will move you towards sovereignty, even in the context of the British Empire, that we see kind of echoed and reverberated throughout in all of these different really interesting experiments and transformations that this little princely state is really heavily invested in. So we track it through education. Surya Namaskar has become mandatory for all the school children of the state, even through the economy, where like sort of self-sufficiency, self-reliance becomes a motto that is enacted through state policy. It's the site of what we think is India's first democratic constitution. The Raja gave up his kingdom to his people, and it was precisely because he believed everyone had the capacity for self-governance, that he thought this was possible. So yeah, Aundh is a super interesting place. We kept seeing references to a film that he would screen throughout India and in Europe, and we weren't able to find a copy of it in India. And we happened to contact an archivist at the British Film Institute, who was able to track down a copy of a film that was actually unmarked in the Institute's archives. They didn't know what they had. I don't know that anyone had seen it. The Raja, we think, delivered it in London in 1936 when he was traveling Europe. So we were able to, using the support from the University of Washington Libraries, to have it digitized, and now it's available on YouTube for listeners who might be interested.
And I'd add to that the Surya Namaskar is such an interesting problem for modern yoga, because it is a signature feature of modern yoga, and yet, as so many have pointed out, Mark Singleton's wonderful book, it's not clear how it makes its way into that, because Krishnamacharya, one of arguably the kind of the pathway through which modern yoga kind of emerges in the world, at first you sort of rejected it, or it wasn't really part of his practice. It was a separate sort of thing. And on the other hand, the Raja of Aundh, he is not really that, he is not a yogi as such. He's not a yogi. He's not interested in any yoga lineage, because he's a king. As Sunila said, he's a sovereign. He doesn't need to connect whatever he does to whatever someone wrote in the 14th century or the 15th century. He doesn't care, because he does his thing. And most people have accessed his work in English. And in English, he doesn't use the word yoga. He doesn't use the word asana. He tends to avoid that. And so there's been a general assumption that the Raja of Aundh, Surya Namaskar, was not considered part of yoga. It wasn't considered part of asana practice.
Or he didn't understand it.
Or that he didn't understand it, and that others didn't. There are Hatha texts of the early 19th century, mid 19th century, that explicitly say Surya Namaskar is not part of Hatha Yoga. So what we try to point out is, first of all, that Hatha Yoga is not the only kind of psychophysical yoga that exists. And that what we can guess is that through the Surya Namaskar, you see this connection to a kind of Maharashtrian, Marathi psychophysical culture that is embedded in a mixture between martial culture and yogic culture, in which the Surya Namaskar, as well as other words like Sashtang Namaskar, which means placing these 8 ports of your body on the ground, or the Danda Namaskar, which means making yourself like a stick or a rod on the ground, are all interrelated, and we're all interrelated in a world of exercise. So Vyayama, that was used, the terminology which is the same as yoga. So yoga and Vyayama are interchangeable words in the Raja of Aundh's work. He doesn't see them as separate. And when he's writing in Marathi and he's writing in Hindi, he's using the word yoga to describe the Surya Namaskar. He also uses asana. And he uses all these other terms that are very common. In the film, there's his son doing nauli, which is this hatha yoga thing you do with your stomach. I can't do it, but I'm sure you can. And so, it's very clear that these are understood in yogic worlds. The difference is they're not understood in a yogic genealogy. And this is very different for Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois and Iyengar and Ashtanga Yoga, that genealogies were very important for them. But it just wasn't important for the Raja. For the Raja, all that was important was this physical practice that could have a powerful effect on things that you might want to control. And those things are things like your weight, your blood pressure, right? Your skin, your muscles, but they're also your spirit, your mind. And as Sunila's pointed out, your politics. The first stage, we had talked about the mandala theory earlier, which positions an individual at the center of possible power situations that could be detrimental or beneficial. The Raja Vaund is using this idea. He's saying every individual, and this is a kind of liberal democratic concept, every individual will be surrounded by choices, positive, negative influences, and their responses will grow out of their self-control. Right? So that is an interesting problem for us. How does this guy who rules over a princely state surrounded by the British, right? So this is an so-called independent state. He's surrounded by the British. His very state is a metaphor for the mandala, for how a king surrounded by enemies has self-control and can empower themselves so that they can positively affect those relationships by defeating those enemies or by converting them to friends. So we see this as we end the book with the Surya Namaskar, not only because it plugs us right into the modern postural yoga arguments, but because it's so clearly a physical representation of that political concept that we think is at the very origin of the broader kind of idea of yoga.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what he said, like you can only resolve the problem, we were only able to resolve the problem for ourselves, is the Surya Namaskar yoga or not for the Raja, by looking at Marathi sources. So the first things that he writes about the Surya Namaskar, he becomes such a devotee, a fan of it, that he makes a film, he writes all these books, and the first books that he writes are in Marathi. So he it's very clear from his Marathi texts, and then from his autobiography, which is also in Marathi, that the Surya Namaskar very much is yoga for him.
Did he also write in English, or was it translated into English? There's that book, The 10-Point Way of Health, I think, that Singleton talks about. And
one of his trips in Europe, he was interviewed by this British journalist, kind of a muckraking journalist, Louise Morgan.
Okay.
And that book is kind of, it's the Raja Vaund with Louise Morgan is how the text appears. So that is kind of an English version of the book that he did with her that has some more explanatory information. But there were already English versions of the Surya Namaskar before the 10-point way.
Written in English. He wrote in English.
The Raja Vaund was a well-educated figure in Marathi and English and versatile in both. So
for the sake of time, I have many more questions, but I'll start to wrap things up here. But to bring this kind of to the contemporary, today yoga is right at the forefront of politics and nationalism in India today. We are greeted by the Surya Namaskar statue at the Indira Gandhi Airport in New Delhi, reminding us of India and yoga's heritage. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is leading Surya Namaskar in front of thousands, record-breaking numbers of people, right? At this International Day of Yoga. We talked about kind of that at the beginning of this podcast. I think for a lot of practitioners of yoga today, I think both in, but especially outside of India, there's a lot of anxiety and confusion about how to understand and relate to this kind of tension between yoga and the political realm in India today. especially around events like International Day of Yoga, which will be celebrated next month in June on the summer solstice. I see this every year. There's kind of this like polarization of posts on social media of people who are both celebrating International Day of Yoga and then other people who are kind of like criticizing it or wanting to draw attention to some of the problems with it. I think a lot of people are kind of caught in this sticky, sensitive discourse, wanting to honor and acknowledge yoga's Indian and Hindu or Buddhist, cultural heritage, but then also not wanting to, unknowingly kind of promote a certain type of ideology or nationalism that might be, associated with that. So this is kind of a long-winded question for you guys of, what do you say to the yoga teacher or the yoga practitioner who's just trying to wade in that discourse, sensitively, with awareness, with cultural discernment? How is one to act? How does one act, O Arjuna? O Christian, O Sunila?
Okay, great. Great question. I think there are a number of different ways to answer it. But one thing I'll say is to go back to the very beginning of the talk when I sort of laid out one of the origins of the book was to try to make sense of these three intersections of yoga and politics. We were struck by the numbers of people who were saying like that they were kind of surprised and a little bit dismayed that Modi had called for this International Day of Yoga. And at the time, there was a lot of language of like, well, yoga is not, it shouldn't be sullied in this way. It shouldn't be mixed with politics. And to our initial reaction was kind of, hasn't it always been? I mean, we knew of course, that Gandhi understood himself to be a karma yogi. We also knew from the work of someone like historians like William Pinch that warrior yogis are, feature throughout India's history. So if that's the case, then how does that change how we might think about what Modi is doing? The other thing, one of the things that we say about yoga in the introduction is that it's really kind of flexible. It doesn't prescribe an endpoint. We describe this in the book as non-teleological. So unlike liberalism, which is a political philosophy that kind of suggests that we as individual rights-bearing subjects, like that those rights will just expand and the universe of people who holds those rights will keep expanding. That is the sort of promise, the liberal promise, liberal democratic promise. Yoga doesn't have an endpoint that it promises. It promises you control, but you can exercise that control in the service of lots of different political ideologies. I mean, it's not, we were a little surprised and a little unnerved to find that the title of our book, The Yoga of Power, was also the title of a book written by an Italian fascist, Julius Evola.
Okay.
So, fascists have been drawn to yoga. The idea that you have a strategy or a technique of claiming power is something that lots of different kinds of people would find important and useful. People with liberatory politics, people with politics that aim to control and subjugate. So that's one way of thinking about it, is that it's not unusual, and it is incumbent on us to sort of make our own decisions about what kinds of ends to put our yoga towards.
Yeah, I think that when we entered into this project, as Sunila said, kind of at the beginning, with certain things happening, not just Modi's election or his use of yoga as a kind of soft power out in the world, which many people have written about, but also issues of cultural appropriation, issues of freedom of speech, all kinds of things that were kind of happening, very political things that really require you have a political position. We figured that was kind of where we were going to go. Having spent so long writing and researching this book, in that meantime, many others have written about these subjects. So one of the subjects, if you look for yoga and politics, you'll find are multiple books and papers and ideas about Modi and the Hindu right and yoga, or about yoga and capitalism, or about yoga and cultural appropriation. And we've written into these things too. We have also written about these subjects. It's part of the course too, that we talk about these subjects. But we were not guided, just like we were not guided to search for Hatha Yoga, right? In particular, that wasn't going to be what we assumed yoga was. We have not assumed a politics to yoga either. For the reasons Sunila said, we see it as non-teleological. We don't think it implies any particular politics. So the person who pursues yoga, I think, should understand that they're pursuing something that is interconnected, not discontinuously connected, interconnected to a practice people have been doing, or a set of ideas people have been applying to the world of power for 3,000 years, maybe more. There is no single ideology that can account for that. People will claim many ideologies, but there's no single one. So clearly, yoga has flourished in Islamic culture, Christian culture, in Jain culture, in atheistic culture, in capitalist culture. So we think that someone who practices yoga is not practicing a politics. That in the practice of yoga, they very well might express their politics, or forward their politics, or change their politics. But the practice itself, we don't think is embedded in a politics. But in terms of what we do in our book, we actually, so as I've said, that a lot of people have written about these other subjects in the one that you've just asked us about. What we try to do is something we don't think a lot of people have written about, which is what happens at the intersection of yoga and politics that is about the control of power, right? What happens in India from 1947, when India becomes independent, until, let's say, 2014, when Modi is elected. So we are also curious about what happens in that time period, because we don't think people have talked about that. And that is a period of what we call the kind of bureaucratization, the creation of a bureaucratic structure for psychophysical yoga and yoga philosophy. And this happens in health, this happens in education. And it's interesting to note that even Hindu right proponents of yoga in health and in education will refer to yoga as secular, because India is a secular state. It actually has declared itself in an amendment in, I think, 73, a secular state, which is something very different than in America, where we have no declaration of being a secular state. And so you can't teach something or institute something in public health or in education that isn't secular. So the politics of yoga are very different as you move around in these spheres. And people are selecting, electing, deploying yoga as they conceive of it to and for their own politics. But we don't think anything is inherently within any of the concepts of yoga that we engage with, whether it's philosophical, psychophysical, or as political thought and practice, that implies any particular, let's say, modern political ideology.
I do think the implication, though, of yoga, even yoga as psychophysical practice, like the yoga of the Hatha Yoga text, is to find a well-governed land in which to practice your yoga. How you define that is left. It's not specified in the texts. That's up to you. It's up to you to find a well-governed land. And if it's not possible to find one, I guess to make one where you are.
And by the way, just because of what Sunila mentioned about the Italian fascist, we state in our book, and we might as well state now, we are as political people very opposed to all forms of fascism, all forms of oppressive political thought, whether that is in India or whether that is in America. We are as political people opposed to it, but we didn't write the book as an expression of our politics. We wrote the book as an expression of this concept we were trying to explore. But we are aware that there are risks when you write a book like this, that people will, especially if it has the same title as an Italian fascist book, that people might think that we have a particular politics we're trying to express. If anything, and we've made clear, our politics are against all forms of oppression.
Yeah, well, I think those ideas come across clearly. If somebody actually reads the book, of course, people that might, waive those sort of oppositions tend not to actually read your work, but we can't do anything about that.
No.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I think your work, this book, really has expanded our understanding of yoga tremendously. I think we'll have an impact, both in the academic world of yoga studies, but hopefully, and with a course like this that you're going to offer online at Yogic Studies to, impact yoga practitioners and teachers and people who, for whom these ideas and sets of practices really matter, and who really informs their lives a great deal. So if you've made it this far in this episode and you want to learn more with Sunila and Christian, you're in luck, because they're going to offer an online course at Yogic Studies entitled Yoga, Power, and Politics. It's going to be a 4-week online course that is set to run from June 30th to July 25th, 2025. But if you're watching this in the distant future and the course has already aired, everything's been recorded, and you can still join us and engage in svadhyaya, or self-study, self-governed study of this topic. So I think we'll leave it there for now. Again, thank you both so much for your time and for your scholarship, and for offering this course. I think this is going to be a great addition to our curriculum, and really fills an important space within the history of yogic ideas and practices. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth. Thank you so much.
All right. And thanks to all of our listeners. Please subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment. And thanks, everyone. Take care. And we hope to see you in class for what should be another great class at Yogic Studies.
Bye.